Welcome, Psych 101 students, to Module 3, Learning Objective 2. We will look at how infants and children develop, or at least we'll begin to. Okay. This is, once again, coming from Chapter 4. And let's begin with, I guess, how the brain changes. Okay. So we're going to start with looking at physical development early on. So as infants and children develop, the brain changes in two critical ways. First, myelinated axons form synapses with other neurons. So connections between neurons take place. This happens very rapidly early in development after birth. The brain develops tremendously during the first few years of life in particular. Just think about, comparing a newborn to, let's say, a 2 or 3-year-old. I mean, there's just so much that develops in these first few years. Remember, myelinated axons are axons that have a myelin sheath on them for faster neural communication. They tend to belong to more important, parts of the brain and the nervous system. Over time and with experience, the synaptic connections are refined to preserve the most important and helpful connections. The brain overproduces connections early in life. For instance, I can tell you that a 6-year-old has more connections in their brain than you do as an adult. So there's an overproduction early in life, and this allows the brain a lot of flexibility because a young child is learning so many new things, and so they need, the brain needs to have a lot of extra pathways to support new types of learning. Anyways, over time, what happens is that once the child gets into, once the child becomes an older child and then into adolescence, connections that are not that important are pruned away. They disappear. So the brain overproduces connections, and then based on experience and learning throughout childhood, there is an establishment of the most important or critical connections, and the connections these extra connections that aren't being used, they're just going to slow the brain down, so they disappear, and so the brain becomes more efficient and faster as this pruning takes place. And once again, I might have mentioned this before, but it's like, you prune off the dead branches of a bush, and then the ones that are left will grow stronger and faster. Unfortunately, sometimes infants and young children are raised in environments that do not stimulate their brains properly. You can see, in this first picture, let me zoom in here. In this first picture, you can see it looks like a crowded orphanage, where there's just child after child after child, and this has been the situation at times in poor orphanages, where there are just a ton of children, young children, that basically stay in their cribs all day with very little stimulation or comfort from others. And this can have a profound effect early in life on the developing brain. So let's take a look at the second picture here. The picture on the left is a 3-year-old that had minimal exposure to language, so they weren't spoken to a lot, minimal exposure to touch, so they weren't held a lot, and minimal social interaction. They weren't interacted with much. And you can see that this 3-year-old has a significantly smaller head. The brain scan on the right is a normal 3-year-old with an average head size. So this is you can see how profound of an effect extreme neglect can have on the developing brain. I mean, it actually is going to develop much smaller, and the head as a whole is going to develop much smaller, which was obviously going to have profound long-term effects. The best development that is when development takes place in environments that have rich stimulation and comforting contact with your caregivers. So you're held a lot, you're played with, you're touched. You have experiences. You interact with objects. You leave your home on trips to a zoo or to a child care center or wherever. You interact with other peers, of your own age. Anyways, all these things help the normal development of a brain. You need exposure to these kinds of experiences early in life for normal development. Okay, let's go on here. So environments certainly can affect an infant's brain development. One particularly, one particular environment that has extreme effect, is living in poverty. The stress associated with poverty, the poor nutrition, the possible exposure to toxins is increased. These can all bring adverse effects to the development of the human brain. And so we know all these things exist, at least often exist in families that live in poverty. There is more stress within the household. The infants tend to be interacted with less. They tend to be spoken to less. Their nutrition is poor, and people living in poverty situations often have more chance of being exposed to toxins because of where poor neighborhoods are situated. Okay. And also, the younger the child is growing up in poverty, the greater the long-term damage that we can expect. Because those first few years of life are critical to normal development. Fortunately, these problems are not inevitable, as programs that help parents stimulate the children's brains reduces the effect of poverty on brain development. It's not a sure thing. When I say, growing up in poverty can have all these negative effects, it often does. But, if parents are aware that they have to interact with the child and to expose them to different types of stimuli and things like that, then with the proper knowledge or training, parents can learn to still bring up a child in a healthy way, even while living in poverty. And there are programs that do assist parents in doing so. When a baby is born, they are born with a number of inborn reflexes, meaning that they're not learned. They're inborn means means that you're born with these reflexes. They already exist. So they're hardwired, as it says here. And these reflexes aid in survival. There's a purpose to them. Here, there are three of them mentioned here. The rooting reflex is shown in the first picture. And this just means that if you touch a baby's cheek, they will turn their mouth towards the touch. The rooting reflex helps them find the nipple for feeding. So, often it would, in a breastfeeding situation, or in a bottle feeding situation, if the nipple misses their mouth, they will turn their mouth to latch onto it. The sucking reflex, shown in the second picture, is that if something enters their mouth, then they will automatically suck on it. And obviously, this is also connected to the first one. It's going to help them feed. So the rooting helps them find the nipple. The sucking reflex is once the nipple enters the mouth, they will automatically suck on it. They don't have to learn to do it. It's a reflex. And this is why if you put your finger in, as this person's doing, they will suck on it as if it's a nipple, even though they're not getting any nutrition from it, but because it's a reflex, they don't really have a decision. It occurs automatically. The grasping reflex, shown in the third picture, is that if you put your finger in the palm of an infant's hand, a newborn's hands, they will grasp on to your finger, um, and very tightly. And because it's a reflex, they can't decide to let go. This is why this person here is showing that you can even lift the baby. And I'm not saying to do this, okay? This is a professional here working with the baby, but they will continue to grasp your thumb or your finger, tightly without letting go, and so they can support their own weight with this grasp. This grasping reflex, some believe it comes from our prehistoric ancestors when young primates had to cling to their mothers' backs. So they would grasp tightly. Once again, they can hold themselves up, and while the mother primate was climbing a tree or running through the forest or whatever, swinging through the branches. I don't know. But all of these, you can see all of these have survival purposes to them. These are the three that we're covering in this chapter. I'll mention that there are a number of other reflexes. You don't have to know them. I'll mention a few. There's the Babinski reflex. There's a stepping reflex, a crawling reflex. There's a swimming reflex. There's a startle reflex. And there's others as well. But make sure you do know about these three here. Yeah. Maturation refers to physical development of the brain and body, preparing an infant for voluntary movement, such as rolling over, sitting, and walking. Let me go to the next slide here. Here we can see the typical sequence for most humans. I'm not going to go through it. You can look at the picture yourself, but this is the normal sequence. And, babies learn to end up walking without any formal teaching. We don't have to teach a baby to walk. They'll end up figuring it out on their own. There are things we can do to help, but it's not required. But the age that children develop each of these skills shown in the picture, it does vary quite a bit. So what's shown here are the average ages for each skill. But keep in mind that that babies can be weeks off of these average ages and still be considered to show normal development. You can see if you look at the final picture on the right. So basically what we call learning to what we call walking, when they can actually walk without assistance. You can see it's right at 12.1 months. So that's easy to remember. It's right at the end of the first year. The average infant starts walking at 1 year old, 12 months. But once again, there are some that do it at 9 months, or others that wait till 15 months. Sorry, I should say, 15 months. So like it can be a few months. These milestones can be a few months off without being considered abnormal. Another note I want to mention is wait a second. Oh, also children may deviate from the sequence, for example, by skipping the crawling phase. So it's not, you don't have to do every one of these. I mean, most of them you will see. The one that's most likely to be skipped is crawling. Yet it doesn't affect their overall motor development abilities or their walking abilities. I mean, you could skip that and still develop normally. Well, why would they skip the crawling phase? Well, when infants sleep on their backs, this often is what leads them to skip the crawling phase, because when they sleep on their backs, they don't properly develop the stomach muscles that are needed to crawl. But even knowing this, pediatricians will strongly recommend that you put infants on their backs to sleep. Probably there may be some of you that know why. Well, since about the mid 1980s, research has shown that placing infants on their backs to sleep reduces the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. And obviously, preventing SIDS is far more important than making sure that a baby, learns to crawl before they walk. It doesn't. We know it doesn't affect long-term motor development, so it's not that important that they learn to crawl. So, the going back to SIDS, the program. I remember when there was a big media push and a big push in psychology to, and the phrase that was used was, back to sleep, and it was teaching parents. It was a campaign to teach parents to put their infants on their backs to sleep, uh, in order to prevent sudden infant death syndrome. Um, okay, yeah, let's go on here. Sensory development. Oh, by the way, just I did have one more thing I was going to say. If you want your baby to learn to crawl, I mean, and you still should put them on their backs to sleep. If you give them enough tummy time during the day, when when they are with you and wherever, and you are observing them, not when they're sleeping, but when they're in an awake state, and you put them on their tummies, they will still develop those stomach muscles if you put them on the stomachs enough, and they'll still learn to crawl. So they can do this during the daytime, which is why just some babies skip the crawling stage. Okay, go on here. Sensory development. As infants obtain information from the world, well, they obtain it by using their senses, obviously: hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, and perceiving touch. The five senses. Some of these sensory abilities are more fully developed at birth than others. We're just going to look at a few points here. We know that from testing their taste sensation, that they certainly can distinguish taste when they're born, and we know that they prefer sweet tastes. By the way, a mother's milk does have some sweetness to it, which helps the infant want it and enjoy it. Newborns can also hear well, so their hearing's well developed, just as their taste sensation is. The one that is least developed of the senses is their vision, and they do have very poor vision when they're first born. In fact, if an adult had the vision of a newborn baby, they would be considered legally blind. Um, an infant can only see clearly in the range of about 8 to 12 inches away from their eyes. So there's this, short, there's a short kind of window of between 8 to 12 inches, like a 4-inch window where things will look clear to them, but they'll be blurry if they're closer or farther away. But what I've always found interesting is, you think about 8 to 12 inches, kind of picture how that far that is from a baby's face. Well, it's about the distance a mother's face would be from an infant's eyes during breastfeeding. So you're holding them against your chest, and the baby's breastfeeding, and this is why the babies will often look up into the mother's face, and your face will just end up being in that 8 to 12 inch range away, where they can kind of clearly see your face, and they will often look into your eyes, because they do like high contrast patterns, like black white patterns, kind of like those that are shown in these mobiles in this picture. Um, One last point is that about their vision, they cannot distinguish colors at birth, and that'll take in 2 to 3 months to develop. Okay, and the last major topic of this learning objective is attachment, which is the emotional connection that we share with those that we feel closest to. And as an infant, that would be typically first be your primary caregiver. Um, I like to use the word caregiver. I mean, you often, most of the research is done with mothers, and generally speaking, mothers are the first attachment figure, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, it's whoever's doing, the majority of the caregiving. Um, so infants have a fundamental need to form strong connections with their caregivers up until the late 1950s. Actually, so yes, Gretchen, but during it was during the 1950s, but also before that. So up until the late 1950s, psychologists generally believe that the care of an infant needed that the care an infant needed was based primarily on getting food from the mother. This included Freud was a believer that the baby forms an attachment because the mother feeds them. Also, the early behavioral psychologists, they believe that the same thing that is. I mean, they both had different takes on it, but what it boiled down to is both Freud and the behaviorists said attachment forms because the caregiver provides them with nourishment. The feed basically feeds them. So you're supposed to become attached to whoever feeds you, according to all the early psychologists. The Harlow monkey attachment experiment really changed our thinking on this. It was a very important study. Let's take a look at it here. Here we go. So Harlow's monkeys and their surrogate mothers, and uh, the hypothesis was that infant monkeys will form an attachment to a surrogate mother that provides comfort rather than food. And so the way that Harry Harlow did this study was that he would take infant rhesus monkeys uh, right after they were born, so that and they separate them from any other monkeys and separate them from their mothers. So they were basically orphan monkeys, and he provided these two surrogate monk mothers, I guess, surrogate mothers, to these orphan infant monkeys. Okay, so you can see them in the picture on the left here. They had one mother made of cloth. I think it was called terry cloth. It's very soft. The other monkey was just made of wire, but only the one made of wire would provide food to this infant, and obviously it needed to eat to live. So it was, this experiment just contrasted the ideas at the time that you're supposed to attach to whoever feeds you with Harlow's, hypothesis that it was more about comfort, who provides you with comfort. And he called this contact comfort. And so the results were that the monkeys clung to the cloth mother and went to it for comfort in times of threat. He tested this by scaring these infant monkeys. We know that monkeys, the same as humans, that when you get scared as a youngster, you go to your attachment figure. Whoever your primary attachment figure, that's who you want to run to when you get scared. So he would actually send in this little noisy robot machine to scare these baby monkeys, and he would see where do they go to, and they would run to the cloth mother. In fact, they only went to the wire mother when they were hungry and had to eat. They didn't spend any extra time there. And I've seen pictures where they tried to like keep clinging to the cloth one while they, put their mouth over to eat. Like they wanted to keep holding on to it, and so they really didn't like the wire monkey. Conclusion: infant monkeys will prefer and form an attachment to a surrogate mother that provides comfort over a wire surrogate mother that provides milk. And so this showed us that it was, in fact, contact comfort that formed attachment. It is your mother holding you, not your mother feeding you, that causes you to become attached to her. If they're holding you when you're, particularly when you're afraid, and it is the comfort and the contact when she feeds you, the baby is pressed against the mother, and that's providing the emphasis for attachment, not the feeding itself. So, the question at the bottom is: do these findings imply that children can become attached to their mothers, even if they are regularly bottle fed by others? And certainly, yes, the answer is yes. A mother does not have to be the one that feeds the infant in order to become attached to it. It is about being a sensitive and caring caregiver while you are with an infant and holding them, and when they need it, and singing to them, whatever, and rocking them, and changing them, and all those other things. That's going to drive the attachment process. And it's certainly true of fathers as well. Like I mentioned mothers again, and they mentioned mothers in this. But if the father is one that's primarily holding and comforting the infant, um, then the father can be the first attachment figure in some cases. Okay. Um, let's look at some variations in attachment. So separation anxiety occurs in all human cultures. Separation anxiety is a sign of attachment. Remember, separation anxiety is like when you try to leave, or an infant or a young child, or drop them off somewhere, and they show distress or anxiety, or they cling to you. That is a sign that they're attached to you. You should be very happy if it's your child and they show separation anxiety. It's not a weakness. It is a sign that they really are attached to you. Um, let's take a look. I'll come back to the slide, but a little bit more about separation anxiety. It begins between the ages of about 8 to 12 months. And this is when infants start to show distress when they're separated from their caregivers. You can see in this graph here that separation anxiety increases dramatically as infants get up towards the end of their first year of life. So I said, between 8 to 12 months. They only show up 10 months here, but you can see it's right after about 8 months that you see this rapid increase in negative reactions that infants are showing, and this graph would continue to go upwards, as you get up to 12 months. You know. Okay, I'm going to go back. Mary Ainsworth has been one of the primary researchers of attachment. She's really probably the most associated name with attachment research. She spent decades doing this kind of research, and she created something called the strange situation test. And in this test, like you are testing to see to look for attachment between an infant and a caregiver. And usually, once again, we're usually testing this with mothers. Um, during this test, it starts in a playroom with the mother and the infant. And when I say infant, I mean this includes up to 2 years of age. So they often test them between 1 to 2 years of age. So when they are mobile and can move about. So what you first observe is um, how comfortable an infant plays and explores on their own, within this playroom. And they in these testing centers, they have kind of hidden cameras to record what happens. And then, like, at some point, there's a number of steps. At some point, a stranger enters the room, and you want to see the infant's reaction. Um, one of the very important steps is the mother leaves the room at some point, and so you're looking for, is there separation anxiety? How does this infant react? And equally important is when the mother returns to the room, how does this young child or this infant react? based on the results. And there's, I skipped a couple of things. There's actually, I think, about 9 phases. There's a couple of times when the mother leaves. At one point, when the mother leaves, the strangers in the room. At one point, the infants by themselves. Okay. Anyways, it, it revealed 3 attachment styles. Um, excuse me. One of them is positive, secure attachment. The other 2 are negative styles, avoidant attachment and ambivalent attachment. We'll look a little bit further at these. Um, a secure child is distressed when the caregiver leaves. The child's also quickly comforted when the caregiver returns. Um, I'm not going to add much here because we have some more on the upcoming slides. Okay, an avoidant child is not distressed when the caregiver leaves. The child also avoids the caregiver when the caregiver returns. You basically it's basically a lack of attachment. You can where there, this um, this child doesn't seem to have any attachment to the parent, or caregiver, I should say. An ambivalent child is inconsolably upset when the caregiver leaves. So that shows that there is separation anxiety. So there's some kind of attachment. The child will also both seek and reject caring comfort, caring contact when the caregiver returns. It's This is a sign of an unhealthy attachment. There is an attachment that exists, but it's unhealthy. The child is not comforted normally, like in the picture on the left when the mother returns. It's kind of like often what you look for this category is an anger response. So the child wants to be comforted by the mother, but at the same time the child's angry with the caregiver. So let's look at these just a little bit more in depth here. Secure attachment. This is the attachment style for most infants who are confident enough to play in an unfamiliar setting or environment, as long as the caregiver is present, and they're readily comforted by the caregiver during times of distress. So during the play phase, the infant uses the caregiver as a what's called a secure base, meaning that they're willing to go off and play. So they will, they don't cling to the mother or stay by her side. They'll go play with interests and toys, but they keep the mother in. I keep saying mother, but they keep the caregiver in view. So they'll go off and play. You'll see them every now and then looking back to make sure the caregiver is still there. Sometimes they may return to show something to the caregiver, and then go off again. But the care, so it's like, they want to know the caregiver's there, and they always keep checking. And this knowing that that their secure base is there, allows them to go off and feel comfortable exploring. These infants certainly become upset when the caregivers depart, which is healthy, normal separation anxiety. So this is what you expect. But they're very happy and consoled when the caregiver returns. They'll typically run to the caregiver, and caregiver will pick them up, and if they're crying, they'll stop, and they'll return to being a happy child once again. And this is all signs of a healthy attachment. Let's look at the more insecure styles of attachment. And the first is the avoidant attachment, the attachment style for infants who are somewhat willing to explore an unfamiliar environment, but seem to have little interest in the caregiver. You don't see that whole secure base kind of thing where they're looking back or returning to the caregiver at any point. They may not, as it says here, they may not look at the caregiver when the caregiver leaves or returns. This is the best way to describe this is a child off in their own world. They don't show any attachment to the caregiver. In fact, they will often act the same way with the stranger that comes into the room as they do with the caregiver. So it's a lack of attachment. This typically comes about if this parent has not interacted a lot with this child, and um, and this could happen for various reasons. I don't want to go into a lot of details like I would in my child class, but it's a lack of interaction. It may be due to mental health issues like a depressed mother, for instance. It could be a mother um, that uses drugs a lot. I mean, it doesn't have to be that extreme, but that's one of the conditions that could cause it. But there's been a lack of attachment building by the caregiver. Okay, ambivalent attachment. The attachment style for infants who are unwilling to explore an unfamiliar environment, but seem to have mixed feelings about the caregiver. They may cry when the caregiver leaves the room, so they do show that separation anxiety, but they cannot be consoled by the caregiver upon his or her return. So they're shown a mixed reaction, is the way it's typically described. Um, they will at times cling to the caregiver, but then they might push the caregiver away. And it's kind of like push and pull. It's like they want to be close, but they also are show these anger responses of like pushing the caregiver away when the caregiver picks them up, for instance. And we can see that in this picture here. This baby's not clinging to the caregiver in this third picture, um, like in the first picture there. Okay. Anyways, um, okay, I think that's about it. Um, and these are once again the two unhealthy, insecure attachment styles, and that will conclude learning objective 2.